Welcome once again to Leto's Law. Here's Steve Leto.
Not too long ago, you'll recall that I mentioned that I have a Civil War cavalry saber. And I told the story about how I got this and so on. And I mentioned that the saber was actually manufactured, and it has a date on the blade of 1865, which places it in the era of the Civil War. The odds of it having actually been carried by somebody in the Civil War, having seen combat during the Civil War, are very slim, but it's a very, very cool thing. And I just mentioned the fact that as a historian, I really respect and admire things like this. And so it's one of my favorite possessions. But I also pointed out that with something like this came into being 100 years before I was born, give or take. And as a result, I recognize that it's going to be on the earth longer than I am. And since it started before me and will outlast me, you really don't own something like this. You merely are the custodian of it at best. So you respect it, you take care of it, but you don't really own it in that sense of the word. And so I mentioned that a while back. And in response to that, a very nice couple contacted me. The wife told me that she had an ancestor who had served in the military in World War I as a doctor, and actually served in Europe. And while he was in the Navy, had been presented with a presentation sword, a naval presentation sword. And so she said, we've had this sword in our family for some time, and we'd be very honored if you consider adding it to the stuff behind you, especially in light of the fact that you said, you don't own something like this. It's just, it is. And so she said, we'd be honored that, hand it over and let you put it in the stuff behind you. And I said, I would be honored as well. And so this sword is the presentation sword that was given to Dr. Franklin Townsend Bower, a physician who served honorably in World War I. And it's a very, very beautiful thing. And I pointed out that, the handle is shark skin, and it's very, very ornate because it was obviously an officer's presentation sword. Very, very different than the sword, the cavalry saber, because the cavalry saber is an actual weapon carried into battle and swung around, and you'd hit things with it, so on. And this obviously is something that you'd wear to ceremonies and so on. It was probably presented at one point, and so they call it a presentation sword. And then after I talked about this, after I pointed out that the original silk decorative things there were worn out because it is so old, someone sent me a replacement one. It's not mounted just yet perfectly, but I'm still in the process of arranging things behind me. And so that's a presentation sword of Franklin Townsend Bower, doctor and officer in the United States Navy, who served honorably, of course, in the European theater of World War I. And so added that to the collection. Couple days ago, I was contacted by Melissa, who said, Steve, I've been following the little subplot on your channel regarding the swords and the sabers, and I understand that you have the cavalry saber from the Civil War, and you have Dr. Franklin Townsend Bower. You have his presentation sword. She said, my grandfather, Zachary, served in the military and left behind a cavalry saber. Very similar to the one that you have, but a little different. But it's similar, but she said, but we don't think he served in the actual Civil War. We think it was a little bit later than that, possibly the Spanish-American War. And I said, oh, okay. And she said, it's just sitting in the closet at our place. If it was on your set behind you, more people would see it. And it seems that you appreciate these things. And I said, I do. And she said, would you be interested, much like the sword of Franklin Townsend Bower, would you be interested in displaying this saber on your set? And I said, I would be honored. And again, it's the same thing. This saber, much like the presentation sword of Dr. Bower, predates me by quite a few years. And I'm reasonably certain will outlast me by centuries. That's a good thing to say about, German steel, which is where this blade was made. It will last quite some time. So she said, well, in that case, we'll pass it along to you. And so it arrived in my office yesterday, and I couldn't be prouder or as humbled as I am to hold this sword. Zachary, like we said, probably carried it around the time of the Spanish-American War. The interesting thing is that cavalry sabers have been used for quite some time. They go back to, obviously, as long as we've had cavalry, and we had cavalry going way back. But there was models of swords, the 1850s, 1860s, and so on. But the most common saber that you see is this particular style. And so you'll notice that they're very, very similar, but the real difference, and I've done a lot of research in the last couple of days about this because I find it fascinating as a historian, is that there's these rings on the scabbard to hold the sword. If you were to attach it to your uniform, you'd have a belt or a leather strap that you would attach it to using these rings. You'll notice that the rings on this black scabbard are about 8 inches apart, whereas the rings on this scabbard are about 4 inches apart. And that is pretty much the only way that a novice like me can tell the swords apart in terms of what style they are. Other than that, the styles are very, very similar. They've got the leather handle wrapped with wire, and then they've got the guard like this, and not much else to identify it. This one does have the Solingen stamp on the blade, indicating the blade came from Germany. And as noted previously, the blade on the presentation sword for Dr. Bauer also came from Germany, which is ironic because, of course, in World War I, Germany was on the other side. But, of course, the presentation swords were ordered long before that conflict broke out. So I'm doing more research on this, and I promised that, Melissa, I would do as much as I could to try to find out more about this sword. And I've been doing some research, but not a lot. But I wanted to introduce the topic simply because people had asked me about the new sword that appeared on camera yesterday for the first time. So, like I said, this sword, if we had to guess, based on this and a few other things, Spanish-American War era. The Spanish-American War was only 1 year, 1898. And, of course, Civil War ended in 1865. So it could have been any time after that. We actually used these cavalry sabers with the cavalry pretty much up until World War I. General Patton, for instance, came up through the cavalry, and I suspect that he had a sword like this at one point or another before he turned over and decided to start carrying the pearl-handled revolvers, which he was so famous for. But so Zachary, Melissa's grandfather, carried this sword at one time or another, and it's a thing of honor, and I am proud to have it on the display behind me. And there's a few minor little clues, like this one has a screw there that my other one does not have. There are some stampings on it I don't recognize. I'm going to do my best to see if I can identify some of the stampings. There's also a little more mystery to this, and this is the kind of thing that the car guys will understand, is that with this saber, for instance, I am not certain that this is the correct scabbard. It's possible this scabbard was replaced and that the sword is 1865, but the scabbard might be later. That's a distinct possibility. It's kind of like having a car where the engine and transmission aren't numbers matching, okay? Everything else is okay until you start looking at serial numbers. And there are guys out there who know a lot more about swords than I'll ever know. And I did a little bit of research. I found some websites, and they're talking about how you can tell whether or not the scabbard is correct, because over time you can imagine that the scabbards can get damaged, the swords can get damaged. There's actually websites you can find where people have actually taken the swords apart, and I've got a part sword, and they take the parts off of it and they try to create one good sword out of two bad swords or whatever. So I got this. I just bought it from a dealer about 5-6 years ago now. So I don't know much about it. Don't know much about the history or anything other than simply what's stamped on the blade. But I'm fascinated by the stories. And I actually had an appointment to meet with the couple that gave me the Dr. Bauer sword before the recent events in the news. But because of that, we had to hold off on meeting. So I will meet with them again. They've got a lot more information. While we were talking, I said, I'll do some research on my end. You do what you can on your end. We'll see what we can dig up. So there's a lot more information about Dr. Bauer that we'll bring out. And then also, I'm going to do my best to find out more about this particular sword. Even if I can't tell you specifically what Zachary may have done with it. I'm hoping to find out more in terms of what era it was carried in, what kind of troops carried it, and where it may have been carried. So that's always an interesting thing. So again, that's the edition. I want to put it over here for right now, but I will, in the future, try to figure out a good way to display these swords as appropriate. There's a lot of stuff behind me that means a lot to me. The microphones, the cars, the law books, obviously, the fun meter. But I admit that a lot of it's frivolous. Okay, a lot of it's frivolous. I like to have fun on this channel. I like to talk about things that are entertaining, and not everything I talk about is life or death. So not everything is real serious, and you got to strike a balance in life, right? All work and no play, but you got to have fun, but you got to be serious. And so behind me with the things, like I said, are frivolous. Just things you talk about because they're fun to talk about. It is important, I think, to remember that there were people, over 100 years ago, who fought for our country, who died for our country, who served overseas, saving lives in the line of battle for our country. And, as a historian, I've written books, and the goal of my books is always to tell the story of what happened in such a way that people will understand why it was important and also will remember it. Okay? The biggest fear historians have is that people will forget things. Okay? We've all heard the story and the adage that, if you ignore your past, you're destined to repeat it. And that's one warning. It's a caveat we can live by. But I think it's extremely important for us to remember our past. There's a lot of things to remember about it. We can learn from it, but we should also honor it. The reason we are here today is that people went before us, and many of them sacrificed. So that, to me, is what these swords represent. Like I said, I am merely the temporary custodian of them because I recognize that they were here before me. They'll be here after me. So I'm proud to have them on my set. I hope you understand, and I hope to do a more in-depth sword analysis in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that. Questions or comments, put them below. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. It was a beautiful day. The sun beat down. I had the radio on.